My name is Sarah Thompson. I'm a 35-year-old single mother living with my 6-month-old son, Ethan. We reside in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I work as an account manager at a local advertising agency. Ethan was born on a cold November night last year. After 36 hours of labor, he came into my life with a healthy cry. The moment I held his tiny hand, I knew I'd do anything for this child. I separated from Ethan's father, John, right after the birth. He said he wasn't ready to be a father and left us. Suddenly becoming a single mother, I was filled with anxiety and confusion. That's when my mother-in-law, Margaret, offered to help and moved in with us. She was 67 and had been living alone since her husband passed away. At first, I was grateful for her offer, but I also felt a bit uneasy. Margaret actively helped with Ethan's care even after I returned to work. Her presence was truly reassuring. For me, working from early morning to late at night, Margaret's help was indispensable. However, after a few months of living together, I began to feel uncomfortable. Margaret's childcare methods differed greatly from mine. For example, she insisted that you shouldn't pick up a baby immediately when it cries, and would sometimes ignore Ethan when he cried. Margaret also frequently interfered with my parenting methods. I often heard words like, "Young mothers these days spoil their children too much," and, "In our day, we raised kids more strictly." Her words sometimes hurt me, but being in a position of receiving help, I found it hard to object. Meanwhile, Ethan grew day by day. His first smile, his first roll over, and recently, he started making sounds that sounded like "Mama." Watching his growth was my greatest joy. One weekend night, I came home unusually early. As I entered the house, I heard Margaret's voice soothing Ethan in the living room. "Now, it's time to sleep. Grandma will put you to bed." I decided to wait quietly outside the room to observe for a moment. However, I didn't know then that this night would drastically change our lives. As I waited outside the living room, I watched Margaret's bedtime routine. Her voice was gentle, as if she had been caring for babies for years. But at that moment, a small doubt sprouted in my heart. Was Margaret really caring for Ethan with his best interests at heart? The next morning, as I was preparing to go to work, Margaret suddenly came into the kitchen. "Sarah, I saw how you put Ethan to bed last night. You need to be stricter," she said. I turned around in surprise. "What do you mean?" Margaret continued, "You shouldn't pick up the baby immediately when it cries. It's important to let them cry a little to develop independence." I couldn't hide my confusion at her words. "But Ethan is only 6 months old. I think it's too early to demand independence from a baby." Following this conversation, Margaret's interference in childcare increased dramatically. She constantly negated my parenting methods and tried to impose her own ways. "You're breastfeeding too often, you're holding him too much, reading picture books is pointless at this age." I was bombarded with criticism almost daily. I gradually began to accumulate stress. While grateful for Margaret's presence, I was pained by her overly intrusive attitude. When I returned from work, I felt like Margaret was even taking away my time to care for Ethan. One day, I mustered up the courage to say to Margaret, "Mom, I'm Ethan's mother too. I have my own way of raising him." However, Margaret looked at me coldly and replied, "You're too young to understand. Follow my experience." These words almost broke something inside me. I felt deeply hurt, as if my ability to parent had been denied. Still, the reality was that balancing work and childcare would be difficult without Margaret's help, so I couldn't defy her. In the midst of this, I contacted John. We had hardly any relationship since Ethan's birth, but I wanted to confide in someone about this situation. "John, I need to talk to you about Ethan," I said over the phone, and he reluctantly agreed to meet. When we met at a cafe, there was an awkward atmosphere as we began our conversation. I talked about the friction with Margaret and sought John's advice. However, his response was cold. "Sarah, that's your problem. It has nothing to do with me." I felt anger and disappointment at John's words. "You're Ethan's father. How can you be so indifferent?" My voice was trembling. John let out a deep sigh and said, "I'm still not ready to be a father. I'll leave everything to you," and he stood up to leave. From that day on, I decided to completely cut ties with John. I felt he had no right to be involved in Ethan's life. At the same time, my relationship with Margaret continued to deteriorate. Her intrusive attitude escalated day by day, and I began to doubt even my own parenting judgments. The daily conflicts with my mother-in-law and the breakup with John. The stress of parenting reached its peak, and I was exhausted both mentally and physically. Still, every time I saw Ethan smile, I strongly felt that I had to overcome these difficulties. That night, I came home late from work, completely exhausted. The clock showed 11 p.m. As I quietly entered the house, I found Margaret watching TV in the living room. "Welcome back, Sarah," Margaret said in a cold tone. "Ethan is already asleep. He was particularly easy to handle today." I felt slightly relieved but also sensed something was off. Usually, Ethan would cry a lot at night, and it was always a struggle to put him to sleep. "I see. Thank you," I replied as I headed towards Ethan's room. As I opened the door, I could hear Ethan's faint breathing in the dimly lit room. As I approached to check on him, my heart nearly stopped. Foam was coming out of Ethan's mouth. "Ethan!" I cried out involuntarily. I quickly picked him up, and his body was abnormally hot and limp. "Ethan, open your eyes. It's Mama." Hearing my scream, Margaret rushed into the room. "What happened?" "Ethan is foaming at the mouth," I explained desperately. "His breathing seems labored, and his body is hot." However, Margaret's reaction was unexpected. "Don't exaggerate. You're just overreacting." I stared at Margaret in disbelief. "This is not an overreaction. There's clearly something wrong with Ethan." Margaret, trying to appear calm, said, "Sarah, you're not used to childcare, so you panic over little things. Ethan is just in a deep sleep." I was shaking with anger and anxiety. This is not normal sleep. I'm calling an ambulance. As I reached for the phone, Margaret grabbed my arm. Stop it. There's no need to take him to the hospital. At that moment, something snapped inside me. I shook off Margaret's hand and said firmly, Ethan is my son. I will protect him. I quickly grabbed my cell phone and dialed 911. Please help, my baby is foaming at the mouth and seems to be having trouble breathing, I explained while following the operator's instructions and holding Ethan close. As the sound of the ambulance siren approached, Margaret stood in the corner of the room with a disgruntled expression. You're really overreacting. By tomorrow, you'll see everything is fine. But I couldn't hear her words. Feeling Ethan's small body hot and trembling in my arms, I was just desperately waiting for the paramedics to arrive. The paramedics arrived and quickly assessed Ethan's condition. We need to transport him to the hospital immediately, they said, and I let out a sigh of relief. As I was about to get into the ambulance, Margaret called out, I'll come with you. I replied without hesitation, no, thank you. I'll be fine on my own. Margaret looked surprised, but I had no time to worry about her feelings. As the ambulance doors closed and we headed to the hospital with sirens blaring, I held Ethan's tiny hand tightly. It's okay, Ethan. Mama's here, I whispered. You're going to be all right. In the ambulance, I reflected on the recent events. Margaret's abnormal reaction, Ethan's unnatural state, and my own intuition. I had a feeling that something much bigger was lurking beneath the surface. When we arrived at the hospital, Ethan was immediately taken to the examination room. I waited in the waiting room, trembling with anxiety and fear, for the doctor's diagnosis. At this point, I still didn't know about the terrifying truth that was about to be revealed. In the hospital waiting room, I spent a long time praying for my son's safety. Eventually, Dr. Thompson appeared and called me into the examination room. Mrs. Thompson, please have a seat, his expression was serious. We need to talk about Ethan's condition. I sat down with trembling hands and listened to the doctor's words. We've got Ethan's blood test results. A significant amount of benzodiazepine class drugs was detected in his system. I was at a loss for words. Drugs. But how? Dr. Thompson continued cautiously, this type of drug is typically used to treat anxiety or insomnia. However, it should never be administered to someone of Ethan's age. His symptoms are clearly due to an overdose. Various thoughts swirled in my head. I couldn't understand how Ethan could have ingested such drugs. Mrs. Thompson, in situations like this, we are obligated to report to Child Protective Services, the doctor said quietly. At those words, I came to my senses. Wait, please. I would never do anything to harm my son. There must be some explanation for this. Dr. Thompson looked at me with sympathetic eyes. I understand. However, this is a serious situation. Ethan's safety must be our top priority. When I returned to the hospital room, my heart ached at the sight of Ethan receiving an IV drip. Looking at the tubes connected to his small body, I made a decision. I must uncover the truth behind this. When I got home, Margaret was already asleep. I quietly entered Ethan's room and started searching for any clues. Around the crib, in the toy box, inside the dresser, but I found nothing. Suddenly, my eyes turned to Margaret's room. It would be an invasion of her privacy, but for Ethan's safety, I had no choice. I quietly snuck into her room and my attention was drawn to the nightstand drawer. When I opened it, I found several bottles of pills inside. Checking the labels, I saw they were the benzodiazepine class drugs the doctor had mentioned. It can't be. I was speechless. The next morning, I decided to confront Margaret about the truth. "Mom, we need to talk about last night," I began nervously. Margaret responded with a composed expression, "What is it?" Drugs were detected in Ethan's body. "The same kind you have." Margaret's expression froze for a moment. But she quickly composed herself. "What are you talking about? What about my medication? Mom, please be honest. Did you give Ethan your pills?" Margaret suddenly became furious. "How dare you say such a thing? I would never hurt Ethan." This reaction only strengthened my suspicions. However, I still lacked decisive evidence. That afternoon, I contacted John. I explained the situation and asked for his cooperation. "Sarah, that's terrible. But what can I do?" John answered hesitantly. "John, you're Ethan's father. Let's uncover the truth together." After a long silence, John sighed. "All right. I'll help as much as I can." We made a plan. John would come to the house and distract Margaret while I thoroughly searched her room. On the day of our plan, John arrived as scheduled. Margaret was surprised by the sudden visit of her grandson's father but began entertaining him in the living room. Taking advantage of this opportunity, I snuck into Margaret's room. As I carefully searched through drawers and shelves, I found what appeared to be a diary. When I opened it, I found shocking content written inside. "Ethan's crying is too loud to sleep. Tried giving him a small dose of sleeping pills. It worked, so I'm relieved. Sarah doesn't listen to my advice. This child is being spoiled too much. I'll increase the dose a bit more." My hands were shaking. This was the decisive evidence. When I returned to the living room, John and Margaret were deep in conversation. I gave John a knowing look, and he nodded in understanding. "Margaret, we need to talk," I said with a trembling voice. Margaret looked puzzled. "What is it?" "I know everything. About you giving Ethan drugs." The color drained from Margaret's face. "What are you talking about?" I took out the diary. "This is the evidence." Margaret was at a loss for words and collapsed into a chair. John stood next to me with a shocked expression. "Why did you do this?" John asked. Margaret answered through tears, I just wanted to keep Ethan quiet. I thought Sarah's way of raising him was wrong." My chest felt like it was going to burst with anger and sadness. But at the same time, I felt relieved that the truth had come to light. "Margaret, you can't stay here anymore," I said firmly. John placed his hand on my shoulder and quietly said, "Sarah, I'll help too. To protect Ethan." At that moment, I saw a sign of reconciliation between John and me. We made a decision to fight together for Ethan's future. After Margaret's confession, the atmosphere in the room was tense. I took a deep breath and considered my next move. "Margaret, your actions are unforgivable. You put Ethan's life at risk," I said as calmly as I could. Margaret looked up, this time with eyes full of anger. "What do you know?" "I was thinking of Ethan's best interests." "That's not love," I interrupted. "Your actions are abuse." At those words, Margaret's expression contorted. "Abuse? Don't be ridiculous." She stood up and walked towards me. John tried to intervene, but I stopped him with my hand. This issue had to be resolved by me. "Margaret, I can't let you stay here anymore. I'm going to call the police," I announced with a shaking voice. At that moment, madness flickered in Margaret's eyes. "You don't understand anything," she screamed and suddenly lunged at me. John moved quickly to restrain Margaret. "Mom, stop it." Taking advantage of this, I pulled out my phone and called 911. "Please help. A family member has been giving drugs to my baby. She's becoming violent now." For the few minutes until the police arrived, the room was filled with an eerie tension. Margaret, still restrained by John, glared at me with hatred. When the police officers entered the house, I let out a sigh of relief. I explained the situation and submitted the diary as evidence. "Margaret Thompson, you're under arrest on suspicion of child abuse," the officer announced, and the color drained from Margaret's face. As I watched her being handcuffed and led away, I was overwhelmed with complex emotions. Anger, sadness, and a bit of relief. After the police left, John and I sat quietly in the living room. After a long silence, John spoke up. "Sarah, I'm really sorry. I should have been involved with Ethan sooner." I let out a deep sigh. "John, I was disappointed in your response, it's true. But I'm grateful for your cooperation in this matter." John looked at me with a serious expression. "From now on, I want to work together for Ethan's sake." Those words lit a small flame of hope in my heart. A few weeks later, Ethan fully recovered and returned home. Seeing his smile made me feel that all the difficulties we had overcome were worth it. True to his word, John became actively involved in parenting. It became a regular sight to see him taking Ethan to the park on weekends or reading picture books together. We're not a perfect family, but we're building a relationship where we respect each other and prioritize Ethan's happiness. One day, when Ethan called me Mama for the first time, tears welled up in my eyes. I was filled with gratitude for having overcome the hardships and made it this far. The future looks bright and full of hope. I believe we can surely give Ethan the best life possible. With this belief, I continue to move forward.